We now go on to our first speaker of the day. And this first lecture will be by Dr. Prantar Chakravarti. Dr. Prantar's biodata runs into 10 pages, so we have had to, of course, curtail it. He was the former professor and head of hematology at the NRS Medical College, Kolkata. And now he's a visiting professor at the Vivekanand Institute of Medical Sciences, as well as a consultant hematologist at the Fortis and Nightingale Hospitals in Kolkata. He is a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the NIH ICMR, a member of the National Committee for Development of Framework for Policy Guidelines for Prevention, Treatment of Management of Hemophilia, the Government of India. And therefore, you can see he's one of the best people to speak to us today. He's also honorary advisor for the Center of Biomedical Engineering and Health Analysis and clinical advisor for the ATGC Diagnostics, Kolkata. I invite Dr. Prantar to now start his lecture.
Thank you, ma'am, and good afternoon, everybody. So this is the second year in a row when we are virtually meeting to commemorate World Hemophilia Day. And I think I would not like to be an astrologer to say how long we will be doing like this. But I think the theme this year aptly sums it up, that we have to adapt to change. And I think this adaptation is more of a mindset change than of technology, because technologies have been there for long. You know, hemophilia care manuals have been there for long, and WFH last year published the third edition of the guidelines on management. But still, we feel that it has to percolate through not only the caregivers, but also the care receivers, so that the power distance between these two groups diminish. And so when I start my case conference today, it will not only be about one 10-year-old child, it would be of all the PWH all over who can present to you in a similar manner, and we will just discuss in a nutshell of what to do and what not to do. So what is our case today? It's a 10-year-old male who has severe hemophilia A, has severe headache and vomiting, right? So the next obvious question which comes in is, do we need more information? Now, if this was a postgraduate, class, then people would say, oh, there's insufficient history. Where is the data? Where is the image and all those things? But let me convince you today that to manage this child, to start managing this child in a better way, you actually do not need more information, except if there's a history of inhibitors or not, because then your standard treatment might not help the child. So I would rather discuss what we should not do rather than what we should do. So we should not wait for the child to lose his consciousness, right? You'll say, okay, there is headache. Let us do an imaging. Let the CT scan be done. Let me look at that image. Or, let the neurologist evaluate and look for focal neurodeficit. Please don't commit these crimes. Because when a known patient of severe hemophilia A presents to you with severe headache and vomiting, for all practical purposes, this patient has an intracranial bleed. So if you want to take a detailed history of what occurred, yes, you might say spontaneous intracranial bleeds are not that common. But if it has happened, it has happened. So better be sure to manage than be sorry later. You cannot wait in the event of a significant headache or you have a clinical suspicion of CNS or intracranial bleed, and immediate treatment with clotting factor concentrate is required. And this I'm quoting from the WFH guidelines. Okay, so this is not my way, that because there are elections even being held in Bengal today, I'm talking like this. These are from the WFH guidelines. You don't wait for further symptoms to develop, and you don't wait for laboratory or radiologic evaluation. because all this will harm the child. So in all head injuries, be it confirmed or even suspected, suppose in a road traffic accident, or say if a child was playing cricket or was in school and had a minor altercation with his friend, and for any significant headache, including headaches which are lasting for several hours. So, the threshold for pain, you have to understand this very carefully. The threshold for pain for every individual varies. So, when someone says, okay, I can tolerate it, but if it goes on for hours, that is the time you should think that whether there has been a bleed. And sometimes the child can present just with somnolence, and that is a danger warning flagging sign. They must all be treated as possible intracranial bleeds. Whatever you want to do in terms of imaging, in terms of other evaluation, please give the first dose of factor in adequate dose. Try to bring up the level to 100% if you have that supply, and then you can do imaging, and then you can look whether there is a midline shift, you need a neurosurgical evaluation or anything. And also remember, because I'm describing CNS bleeds today, sudden severe back pain may be a symptom of bleeding around the spinal cord. We are all aware of SWAS bleeds, but we sometimes forget this. So what is the recommendation of World Federation of Hemophilia? In hemophilia patients presenting with suspected CNS bleeds or bleed-related symptoms, clotting factor replacement therapy should be administered immediately before investigations are performed. And I think in the second, that is 7.3.2, what they tell you more importantly is, it is not only about starting that therapy with clotting factor replacement, it should be continued until the bleed resolves. And if you want to know whether bleeding is occurring or not, there are certain clinical clues. You might need to repeat imaging, but always remember that if you are doing a CT scan, it is equivalent to so many X-rays. So there is radiation hazard there. But if you need it, if you want to take a decision that this child will travel 200 to say 400 kilometers away, unless you're sure that the bleeding has resolved, there is no trickling into that bleed. Because remember, the skull is a closed area. If bleeding continues, the brain will suffer, and it is always life-threatening. Now, so many people ask me, how much should I give? So, it is not that complicated. I would like to point out, just a second. I would just like to point out that you might think that this is too complicated. So I'm highlighting part of this guideline, right? And it clearly says that your aim, whether you are in a higher dose practice pattern or a lower dose practice pattern, forget hemophilia B. If you are in a higher dose practice pattern, if you're in a tertiary center with adequate factor support, your aim should be 80 to 100%. If not, then also at least 50 to 80%. And what should be your maintenance target? Half of what you did initially. And how long should you give it? In a higher dose practice pattern, look at this. Initial dose would be for 1 to 7 days. And maintenance would be for 8 to 21 days. That means it's almost a month-long therapy. If you want to compromise for reasons, supply or other things, then also the duration does not decrease. It remains the same. What you can do is, after 3 days of intensive, raising it to 80, then trying it to raise to 40, and then trying to give around 30, reaching up to 30 to 50, total would be 21 days. So you cannot say that because I do not have enough factors, I will release the child early. You do not have that luxury. And remember that it has to be 7 days. At the most, you can reduce it to 3 days, but your maintenance therapy should go on for 21 days. I hope this is clear, and then my job is done. Now, then people often ask me when to intervene. The first thing you have to remember is it is a team effort. So the neurologist and the neurosurgeons all should be involved, and you should be the fulcrum. You should provide the CFC support and tell them, when you operate this child will be as normal as any other. You forget about hemophilia. I am there in the OT, right? So I will manage the child accordingly, but obviously I will at least rule out inhibitors, because otherwise it will be a catastrophe if you want to operate and this child has inhibitors. And education of the medical fraternity, of the nursing personnel, the rehabilitation department, all of them should be around you, because you are the leader who will manage this child. So don't forget about supportive care, other things like, you cannot afford this child to have constipation, because if he tries in such a situation and the intracranial pressure rises, there can be a fresh bleed. So we often forget that they should be on laxatives so that there is no recurrent bleed. Do not forget your old friend tranexamic acid, and recommendations are that they have to be continued for almost 6 months, because there is a chance of rebleed. And this is the patient who needs secondary prophylaxis. You saw the video on prophylaxis. This child actually warrants secondary prophylaxis to prevent further bleeding. And that is why it is so important that once you have had an intracranial bleed, this categorization of this child being special is so important. So even when you discharge the child, you have to follow them up. And subtle signs like, maybe he's not able to remember someone's name, or maybe he's sleeping more, can be the clinical clue to a rebleed. And then the child should come to you immediately. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and we can discuss this case further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prantar, for a very, very comprehensive and a practical lecture, in fact. And I think giving the don'ts was really a brilliant idea rather than the do's. Yeah. So there are a couple of questions. The first question is from Mustafa Tambawala. He has given a question actually on target joints and such. So we'll take up his question maybe later, because it's not related to the intracranial bleed case which we are doing at present. So the next question is, what is this? In first case with intracranial bleed, is there any role of neurosurgical intervention? Let's say neurosurgeon thinks surgery is indicated. Should we go ahead? Yeah, Prantar.
Yeah. So that is what I told you, that it cannot be an individual's decision. There can be neurosurgical indications, but you have to be clear what is the kind of support you have. If you have enough factors, or if the patient has inhibitors, if you have enough bypassing agents, then only you can decide it. Because sometimes, you do not have enough support, you open it, then it becomes a problem. On the other hand, if decompression is absolutely necessary, then I think you send SOS to all people around you and you take the decision, okay, if I'm losing this child, let the person intervene, let them decompress, and by that time we will get the factors. We will use a lot of tranexamic acid and other agents and try to save the life of the child.
Yeah, that's right. So I would just like to add over here that sometimes, of course, it depends on the individual place, but sometimes the neurosurgeon may say a surgery is required, but if the patient is clinically stable, there are no pressure symptoms, I think we can also take a decision and say, let's hold. Because very often these, and giving complete factor support, very often the patient will settle down. Of course, there's no question of not intervening when there is a problem, further compounded when there is the life-threatening bleed. But otherwise, if a patient is asymptomatic, there is some role for a wait and watch. There is one more question from Dr. Anand Prakash. Does tranexamic acid have any role in IC bleed?
Yes. So definitely it has, because if you look at the data, that's why I told you, if you look at recent review articles, they also mention that even if the patient is on secondary prophylaxis, then also giving long-term tranexamic acid actually can help prevent rebleeds. So it's not about what concentration it reaches there, but antifibrinolytic agents help in the total milieu, because once a bleed has occurred, chances of rebleed are very high. And this is not only for hemophiliacs. If you look at the patients who have subarachnoid hemorrhages, right, there are possibilities of a rebleed. So at least I can tell you that whatever data is there till now, giving it in a right dose helps the child with hemophilia.
The next question is, a 3-year-old child with severe hemophilia, no inhibitors, has resolved a traumatic subdural. Will it require secondary prophylaxis?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, if you go by the third edition of WFH guidelines, there is clearly, they do not name it a recommendation. They give it as a comment under the recommendation that even if it's a subdural hemorrhage, this child is a candidate for secondary prophylaxis. Anyway, we are looking at prophylaxis, especially in the child group. And this child actually, if you're rationing factors, this child will merit secondary prophylaxis.
Yes, that's right. Dr. Yogesh Salve has asked, what are the chances of bleed happening again after a surgery?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are several data. I'll not give you the absolute numbers because they vary from institution to institution and from one cohort to another cohort. But what is clearly seen is the chances of rebleed in a hemophiliac is almost 20 times more than a person who does not have a coagulation disorder.
Yeah, and so that therefore, like Dr. Prantha says, you need to continue the tranexamic acid and also the prophylaxis.
Yeah.
The next question from Dr. Khanna. With intracranial injuries in adults, what factors do we need to consider as there is high chance of stroke?
Yeah, so stroke, see, is a vascular event. Now, you can say that whether hemophiliac adults have a higher chance of getting an intracerebral hemorrhage leading to stroke, right? This has been seen as, fortunately, the chances of spontaneous intracerebral bleed are not that much as we would love to, as our common sense tells us. So if you're talking of stroke and then its associated things, unless there are certain factors, and those factors, let me tell you, can be as subtle as even meningitis. There, the chances of bleed are more, but spontaneous bleeds leading to stroke in a hemophiliac population, though there are no long-term cohort studies for obvious reasons till now, is that the general message is that it is not a very high risk, but even in an adult, if there is a headache or if there are subtle neurological signs, the first diagnosis would be an intracerebral bleed.
Dr. Archit has asked, perioperative neurosurgery, what parameters to monitor, APTT or factor levels?
Yeah, so the best is always if you can look at the factor levels and you can look at the increment. But if you say, you do not have that facility, APTT will roughly guide you as to how much correction you have done. So it's not that, okay, I can't do factors, so I'll not do it. That is not an excuse. You can always use the APTT. And sometimes what we used to do is you do repeated APTTs and sometimes you look at the factor increment, because later on, because I'm telling you, you're managing it for 28 days, right? So at least once or twice a week, you need to know, because if this was the first exposure, then the chances of inhibitor development are also high. So you have to be very careful, and that's why you need to also look at the factor increment level.
Right. In acute IC bleed, we cover 100%. What is the treatment interval of factor VIII replacement? Is it every 8 hours? And for how long before we taper down?
Yeah. So how long, I think I answered in the WFH guidelines. Let me take the first part first. It should be given every 12 hours. Okay, factor VIII, remember, it should be given every 12 hours. Now, even if you give it every 8 hours, there is no such thing. There are certain studies in centers where they have given, IV infusion, but that is not proven to be absolutely miraculous that it will work. If you give the adequate dose, more important is the adequate dose every 12 hours. And, if you look at it from the, say, hemato-oncology point of view, induction and then consolidation, right? So your induction should be minimum for 3 to 7 days, where you give it twice daily and you try to maintain 100%. That means you are giving 50 units per kg. And then you can slowly start tapering. You can target it, say, first 60%. Maybe the next week you can go to 50%, 40%. But this should be dictated by the fact how your patient is doing, right? If the patient has recovered first and it was not a significant thing, your tapering can be earlier, but the duration, actually try to at least give once a day till 21 days of maintenance.
Right. What is the dose of tranexamic acid and which is preferred, oral or IV?
Yeah, so if a patient is conscious and taking, tranexamic acid has a very good oral bioavailability. So giving it IV will not help you. There may be certain issues with the intravenous thing going on. You need to always save the veins of our persons with hemophilia, right? But if the patient is unconscious, peroperative, then obviously intravenous has to be given. In adults, we usually say 1000 milligram thrice a day. That would be considered in a 50 kg person. So if you look at it for children, it comes to around 10 to 15 milligram per kg 3 times daily. That is the usual dose which is recommended.
Right. We are running a little late. So there are a couple of more questions. One is to do with, should we give bolus or infusion? Dr. Pranthar has already replied to that, so we won't go into it. And again, then another question is regarding replacement of factor therapy before investigations are performed. Again, he has covered this in his lecture, so I don't think we will deal with that. And with that, we come to the end of this particular session. Dr. Pranthar, a very big thank you to you and a very big thank you to our delegates for making it interactive and for asking us questions.